We'll start. Yes, we will start. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Mental Health Network of the Faculty of Inclusion and Homeless Health. This is our first ever extraordinary meeting and our first ever book launch, so a very exciting night. For those who don't know me, I'm Jenny Drive. I'm a consultant psychiatrist working with homeless people in South London. I normally chair our Tuesday morning meetings, which are recorded. So I've just been reminded that this meeting is also being recorded. So if you don't want to be on tape, don't say anything or leave. The reason that we're having an evening meeting, an extraordinary meeting this time, is because we have unusually international visitors. I'm delighted that we are introducing tonight all the way from America, from Western Massachusetts, Jay Levy and Louise Levy, who are here to talk about the new book, Pretreatment Across Multiple Fields of Practice. It's actually quite hard to read that in mirror writing, but Pretreatment in Multiple Fields of Practice, which they are co-editors of. I thought
it's a patient that I am discharging. Homeless.
Oh,
yeah. Sorry, there is.
Okay, I think they've been muted, whoever they were. So this is a collaborative book with multiple authors, and many of whom are here today, and we will be hearing from them in a minute. But first of all, just a bit about pre-treatment therapy. I think I'm too English to sound very effusive about things convincingly. So you're going to have to take it from me that I really feel effusive about pre-treatment therapy. I first heard about it a few years ago at a Pathway conference where Jay was speaking, I think, again, on video link from America. And I thought it sounded terrific. And then I read his books and I thought, this is terrific. It fills a gap. So I think in medicine particularly, we're very good at being taught about theoretical models and about eliciting symptoms, but we're not ever given any advice on how to make relationships with people and how to meet people where they're at and work together to create a plan and accomplish goals and make positive changes. And I think this therapy fills that gap. So I'm delighted that Jay has introduced it, and I wish that I had heard about it earlier in my career because it would have saved me a lot of difficulty. So I really urge everyone to read the books. This latest book is as I say, a collaborative work which explains how pre-treatment therapy has been used in multiple different settings. So it's really, really interesting, and I do urge you to read it. My only contribution to the book was to write the foreword, which I must say, I mean, people say things were a privilege, but I really did feel it was a privilege to be asked to do it. So thank you, Jay, for that. And it is also a privilege to introduce you. So I will hand over to you without further ado.
Jenny, and let me just do a share on some slides, and then we'll get going. Okay, hopefully people can see the slides. So let me just begin by giving thanks to Pathway for sponsoring this event, to Alex Bax, to Sophie, to Jenny, of course, for hosting, to George on the tech end, and to Louise, my life partner.
You got to do your thing.
Can you hear me? Yeah. And to Louise, my life partner, for being there and editing, and to everyone from the US and UK who contributed chapters. I really take none of this for granted. This is a hard lesson that I've learned from those who have lost so much and have experienced a great deal of trauma. In fact, just now we can look to the LA fires, I'm sure it's global news, and just know that homelessness can happen to anybody, anywhere. And in fact, to this day, I remain very appreciative to someone who calls himself Old Man Ray. He was a World War II veteran who lived at the Port Authority during the 1980s. You see, it was in the 80s when I was first starting my work in the field, doing outreach. And the Port Authority was one of the places I would do my rounds. And Old Man Ray was kind enough to be my first field supervisor. He taught me some valuable lessons. First and foremost, it's that people are experts in their own worlds. You see, Ray saw himself as the night watchman, kind of like an information center. And so instead of me immediately trying to share my expertise, which of course I tried to do being new in the field, I would have been much better off working on trying to understand Ray's world, learning from his sense of meaning, his ways of adapting, living in such a harsh, homeless environment at the Port Authority. What was working for him? What wasn't working? And how did he find the energy just to, day by day to survive? Um, so Ray had a lot that he could share with me. You know, he really knew the goings on at the Port Authority. And being a World War II veteran, he had stories to share with me. So, in answer to the first question, you know, how do we help those who are not raising their hands, yet clearly are in need of help? The answer to that is really it's all about building relationships, gaining permission to enter people's worlds and developing a common language. And that begins with us getting where people are at rather than trying to get people to respect our expertise from the get go. Secondly, what are the five guiding principles of a pre-treatment approach? So just know these principles can guide us toward getting person-centered. It helps us to establish a productive dialogue and to get goal-focused. And I'm going to review those principles in a moment. Thirdly, how do we apply pre-treatment across multiple fields of practice? Well, that's something that you're going to hear a great deal about from all the other presenters today. That's what the new book is all about. But first, I'm going to begin with reviewing the five principles of pre-treatment, just to give you a little bit of context. So the first principle, okay. Oh, I got it. Sorry. Whoops. Did I lose my share?
You did.
Sorry about that. Let me go back. Okay, the first principle is relationship formation. And everything begins with us developing trust, certainly upholding safety from the get-go. And we're there to respect the autonomy of the client. And there's three basic stages: pre-engagement, engagement, and contracting. Pre-engagement begins with just getting an initial welcomed communication. Engagement is when we really go into some ongoing dialogue, but at the same time, we're developing roles and we're beginning to really tune into the client's common language, to their words, ideas, their values, their challenges, what's working for them, what's not working for them. And we're beginning now to share a little bit about our service, our expertise. And as we go to contracting, we're really looking for that match between the services and the resources that we can offer and the person's needs and wants and aspirations. And that's getting goal focused at this point, which when we get the common language construction, which is all happening throughout this process, common language really focuses that the goals that we do with the client needs to be in their words, their ideas, their values. It needs to reflect that. And when I think of our work in terms of the dialogue that we have the house of language of the client here, the house of language, our house of language here, and in between is the playground of language. And it's the person that we're trying to help that rules the playground of language. Um, and that means any kinds of terms, ideas, uh, referrals, whatever it is that we put on that playground of the language, the client can nix it. They can say they're not interested. And in fact, if we find that we're triggering the client through our words, through our ideas, through our interventions, What we don't want to see is kind of a fight flight response, because that's going to totally dismiss dialogue. I mean, it's really all about jointly creating a productive dialogue. As you're going to see, pretreatment is really a co-production in terms of our work. The third principle, cultural and ecological considerations, that upholds that transitions is happening all around us all the time. And whether it's transitioning to new relationships, new ideas, new services, resources, treatment, housing, and it's really up to us. I say this to my staff all the time, to catch the transition bus. If you really help someone to transition, what you're going to find, let's say it's cold out, because it could be a transition to the weather. You give them a nice pair of gloves. The person might feel like you really responded to their need. That increases that engagement process. It really shows that you're right where the person is at. The fourth principle is promoting safety. And there's two pillars to promoting safety. There's harm reduction and crisis intervention. I always tell my staff to embrace the crisis, because that's really an opportunity for further work. We can more quickly facilitate change when there's a crisis. And we're going to get a little bit more of an active stance, more directive when there's a crisis. And it's our chance sometimes to connect people directly to recovery services and treatment, whether it be medical, addiction, or mental health. Harm reduction, on the other hand, begins with really getting where the person is at, offering some sort of need item that hopefully can reduce harm and increase safety, such as needle exchange, but there's lots of examples. It could be camping gear for someone who's living outside. And it provides us the opportunity to enhance dialogue. It helps the person to begin to contemplate change. I'm often fond of saying it gives us a chance to begin to, perhaps through our relationship and our dialogue, to melt the pre-contemplative iceberg. And finally, facilitating and supporting change. That's based on Prochaska and De Clemente's change model and motivational interviewing, which brings us through the different stages of change. And just know that pretreatment is really good at setting the table for the action stage of change. In other words, it helps brings us through that pre-contemplation, that contemplation, and gets us goal focused. Let me just say that Matt Bennett wrote a great chapter where he really goes into in detail about the change model in this book and motivational interviewing and trauma-informed care. So for this final slide, Michael Rose states, outreach takes place at a border that divides one world from another. Now, on one side of the border is the world of the client or the prospective client. And on the other side is the world of treatment, recovery programs, other crucial resources and services. And if you think about it for a moment, the house of language of the person in need is composed of their culture, their values, their strengths, their needs, their wants, their life experiences, their sense of meaning in the world, and challenges that they face due to homelessness, or if there's an addiction or mental health or a medical concern. All of that is part of their lived world, the world that we're trying to enter. On the other side of the boundary is the house of language of programs and services, composed of the mission of the service, the type of staff training, the type of data that's collected, which then impacts screenings and intakes and the type of questions that we ask of people that we're meeting, the way we measure success, our sort of timeline for the work. All of this impacts the service delivery. And then, of course, there's our own biases and the nagging issue of eligibility criteria. So I think you can see as I bring all this up that sometimes there's a cultural divide, a divide between the client and their world and how they see things and the type of services and resources we offer. And this is really what's really good about pre-treatment. It helps us to cross these cultural divides. It's really all about building relationships, fostering communication on all levels with the folks we serve, with the resources and services that they need, and with our own staff, developing a positive work culture guided by reflective practice. And pre-treatment can even help us in terms of being person-centered with our own staff. It's kind of a parallel process to the work that we do with the clients that we meet. So finally, keep in mind, there's many houses of language, and it's up to human service workers, outreach counselors, clinicians, nurses, educators, to be fluent and nimble with engagement and translation. At the heart of what we do, we're interpreters and bridge builders. So with all that in mind, I'd like to introduce to you my favorite interpreter and bridge builder, my life partner and co-editor, Louise Levy. And just know that her expertise, her house of language, is in education, among other things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. I appreciate that introduction. I've known for a couple of decades just the universality of the ideas behind pretreatment. I'm Louise Levy. I recently retired from teaching science with more than 40 years in mostly public high school classrooms with early formative experiences in outdoor, environmental, and experiential education. And you'll hear in the background that my parakeets are agreeing with everything that's being said today. I am in awe of how powerfully outdoor experiences build agency and empathy, and always looked for ways to bring the outside into my classroom. On countless walks, Jay and I would strategize around parenting our daughters, who are wonderful adults now. But we discuss our days and shake our fists at the frustrations and the episodes that drained us. We talk about how critical it is to build relationships, but how the structure of the workplace could stand in the way of feeling like we were making any progress at all. I can only imagine how much less stressed and burned out I'd have felt if my colleagues had been given time for reflective practice. The best I could hope for when I was at school was a bit of support while waiting for the copy machine, or during our 20-minute lunch periods, or after school on my own dime and my own time. So can you tell I'm a little jealous of the way that Jay has managed his teams over the years? Yeah. Working with struggling people is hard. You know that. But we need to do our best to give frontline workers in all fields a template for effective work grounded in solid psychological theory that allows us to sustain our passion for the mission. This work that we're all doing is too important to leave excellence to chance. As you can probably hear, I have a lot to say about how to get pretreatment's powerful message across, as well as a lot of practice helping my students improve their writing. Hence, that's my editor's cap that I put on for this book. I often had reluctant learners in my classroom. They weren't bad people or even bad students. They were just truly expressing their histories of trauma. Putting principles of pre-treatment, which I learned from Jay on all of our walks, putting principles of pre-treatment front and center really helped me as I built relationships, minimized power struggles with adolescents, and kept them wanting to come to school. As a special ed teacher, my colleague, Virginia Bills, who wrote one of the chapters for the book, worked to build relationships with some of the very same students. She'd read Jay's earlier works, and we'd talk at length, mostly after school, about how to apply common language formation and build trust. In Ginny's chapter, she explores how productive it was to view her work through a pretreatment lens. I trust everybody in the audience today will equally see yourself in this book, even if the description in the stories doesn't match the service that you are in. There's still something that everybody who works with people can gain from this. I have to say we are extremely grateful to Robin Johnson, Mr. Pie himself, who connected us to so many people and taught us about the state of homelessness in the UK. In fact, back in 2018, Jay and Robin co-edited cross-cultural dialogues on homelessness, from pre-treatment strategies to psychologically informed environments. We are forever grateful to all of the authors who've contributed to the cross-cultural dialogues, as also the most current work. I'm going to hand it over now to John Connolly, who we also met through our contact through Robin Johnson. And John began the pre-treatment therapy wave in a small clinic in Soho. And I will hand it over to you, John, to take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. So yes, I trained as a psychologist initially, then a psychoanalyst, and I've been working in the British National Health Service for the last 25 years or so. Before I entered the field of homelessness, I worked in a mental health trust trauma stress clinic, where the work and the approach was very, very structured, using the predominant model of CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. So when I took my post in Soho, leading the homeless health counselling service, it was an absolute shock to me of just how chaotic people were, how many problems they had, addictions, terminal illnesses, surviving on the streets. And they were coming to my service for mental health treatment, for psychological treatment. So it was a buildings-based service, and we were in a medical environment. So my first year was really, really incredibly challenging. And thank God I met Robin Johnson, who immediately directed me to Jay's work on pre-treatment. And immediately I began to understand the limitations of the medical model approach to specifically homeless people and to people who are excluded, because of the extra layers of difficulty that they present with. And what we found, of course, as you all know probably, is that a lot of people suffer from pre-existing mental health conditions, usually trauma, adverse childhood events, leading to complex chronic trauma. And of course, homelessness itself is traumatic. So you're getting a compounding effect of historical and present day trauma, which leads, of course, to self-medication and addictions in order to cope with the disastrous situation people are. So Robin took a real lead in introducing pies, of which she was the originator, into Westminster, the Westminster borough at the centre of London, where all the tourists go and all the tourist attractions are, of course. With a very enlightened commissioner, Victoria Assavathan, who was manager and commissioner of street homeless people in Westminster, Robin and Victoria, with a little bit of help from myself, not much because that wasn't my main focus, introduced pies within hostels and day centres in Westminster. And unfortunately, Robin could not be here this evening, So I really do want to acknowledge his contribution to certainly the PIE's approach in Westminster. Jay very kindly invited me to write a chapter in his latest book. And the title of my chapter was called Time for a Paradigm Change, Pre-treatment and Pretreatment Therapy for People Experiencing Homelessness in the UK. And I opened up the chapter with a poem because I thought it encapsulated the focus of pre-treatment on the individual and its understanding that individuals are irreplaceable, that they are absolutely unique. And that's one of my critiques of the medical model or large systems delivering services, that they lose sight of the individual uniqueness, needs, and strengths. And they go for population-wide interventions, which of course loses a lot of that unique individuality. So Carl Shapiro wrote a wonderful poem called Elegy for a Dead Soldier in 1999, and I'd just like to read a couple of lines. However others calculate the cost, to us the final aggregate is one. One with a name, one transferred to the blessed. And though another stoops and takes the gun, we cannot add the second to the first. And that's absolutely so, isn't it, from our personal experience, that we cannot replace a person with another. Systems, institutions replace the function an individual might have had, but the individual, him or herself, can never be replaced. And this is what attracted me to pre-treatment. and I had to use it as my base, and I had to develop it into pre-treatment therapy, because I was in a medical environment and I had to develop a language with which I could communicate with medical practitioners, explain the rationale in a language they would understand, in a common language, which is a language of science, of evidence-based data. So unfortunately, pre-treatment and pre-treatment therapy are very novel approaches on the block. So there isn't that much evidence to have that dialogue. Luckily, there is massive evidence in other very similar approaches and very similar knowledge bases. So for example, attachment theory. How do people relate? The style of engagement people develop over their lives. A lot of evidence there. Motivation and interviewing. How does one harness someone's motivation for change? Person-centered approach, of course, a lot of data for that and on that. So I was very, very keen to develop the pre-treatment therapy approach. And in my chapter, I argued for how pre-treatment and pre-treatment therapy could be seen as a viable candidate to add to the plethora of approaches to treating homelessness. And to addressing the psychological distress a lot of homeless people present with. So I explained that I chose pre-treatment because it made sense of my experience, and a lot of practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists, GPs, general practitioners, doctors, they have the same reaction, that despite the medical scientific training, they have a very powerful experience of how powerful relationships are in the healing process, not just the engagement process, but the healing process. So in my chapter, I explain why I adopted pre-treatment and pre-treatment therapy, mainly because the specialist mental health services had such long waiting lists, and they had criteria that excluded many homeless people. So they insisted on fixed addresses, for example, or they insisted on people managing their addictions. And 90% of the people who came to us didn't have fixed addresses, or were coping with a desperate situation they were in by drinking or taking drugs. So we were left in between specialist services who were geared towards housed mainstream populations and outreach services or housing services which weren't taxed with providing health, mental health, psychological help. And there we were in the middle. So obviously we used Jay's pre-treatment as our foundation. And then we went on to develop our own therapeutic approach in the face of systemic medical system demands, and also the incredible distress people were presenting with. So we obviously, as Jay pointed out, stages of change, but we went right back to the originators of stages of change, where there is a lot of data and evidence, motivation, attachment, trauma-informed care principles. We used the language and the data that the medical system and culture needed. We promoted our approach a lot. We were constantly invited to go and talk to public conferences, Royal College of Psychiatrists, Royal College of Physicians, Ireland, for example, and we had several interviews. So that although we didn't have hard, concrete evidence, we were beginning to have a profile. We were beginning to have a voice, which obviously grows more and more. So that now, and I'm sure Chris Brown will talk more about that. He will be our next speaker. He wrote a chapter as well. But he has been negotiating for Hull University to host a national conference on pre-treatment and pre-treatment therapy. I have several consultant psychology colleagues who are willing to lobby the professional psychology body, the British Psychological Society, to establish a special interest group there on the psychology of homelessness and social exclusion, obviously where we'll be discussing how can we evidence the fantastic contribution pre-treatment and pre-treatment therapy makes to the field. And there are plans to develop an accredited pre-treatment therapy training, and obviously to write more publications. And I'm planning to complete, probably with the help of most of the authors in this book, of a book specifically on pre-treatment therapy. So there are a lot of wonderful opportunities ahead, for which I very deeply and sincerely thank Jay, Robin, and all those individuals who've been involved in this very exciting initiative, because the initiative, as this book says, can be translated and transported into other fields. So, for example, because pre-treatment is about engagement, I can see pre-treatment post-traumatic stress disorder programs. Pre-treatment is that initial building of trust to enable somebody to engage with quite challenging work. So as we've already heard, it can be transferred to many different fields of endeavour. So without further ado, I will now stop and I will introduce my colleague, Chris Brown from Hull.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everyone. Hello from Hull in Yorkshire. Going to talk to you a wee bit about how we set up or struggled to set up our homeless team in Hull. A few years ago, working with my colleague Dan, who you'll hear from shortly, we struggled to understand how we were flailing and failing to engage with the most stigmatized and marginalized people within our great city, a city that had seen better days in some ways, but remained proud, very working class, very tough, and how we could try and make some form of a breakthrough to people who, as other people have described tonight, continue to suffer significant intergenerational trauma, and ultimately, for some, felt that this was just the way life was and had to be. And we had to try and find a way of how we could break that cycle for people. And as mentioned, we struggled really hard. We didn't quite get it ourselves, and I'll say we didn't get it at all. How our more traditional ways of working, I'm a social worker by background, Dan a psychologist, were just unable to make the breakthrough. And it was eventually, thank goodness, that Dan was able to make the connections with some people on here tonight, which absolutely transformed our team, transformed our practice. But most importantly of all, I hope, without sounding too arrogant, was able to transform for the better some lives of the people we were looking to support and continue to support. Our first steps, ultimately, for me, and excuse me, Dan will come on to in a few moments what that actually boils down to, but was about unlearning a lot of the things that I knew or felt that I knew, ways of engaging and communicating with people, and slowing down and doing less and being present more for those people, because only then at that point would we be able to start through the stages already expressed in this book and previous books, start to develop a way of communication that was meaningful and authentic, and that was long lasting for some of the people within Hull who stayed. Hull is a non-transient city, that there isn't much movement through it. The homeless population, unfortunately, remains significant, but you would find yourself at various stages, at various parts of the year, back involved with somebody's life. And actually, what did that mean? How did people make sense of that? How did we make sense of that? And it was through pre-treatment in particular that allowed us to refocus, to reconfigure our ways of working. Dan, I'll hand over to you soon, mate. If you want to come on board and explain some of the modes and means of doing so, then I'll wrap up a little bit around some case studies, which if you haven't read in the book, I'm happy to share again with you and introduce some other people that we've worked with too.
Okay,
over to you,
thanks,
Dan.
Chris. Thanks. Good evening from Beverley here in East Yorkshire. I'm Dan. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've previously worked as the psychologist in the homeless team in Hull alongside Chris. As Chris is saying, we were working with some very, very distressed people in Hull. Chris was able to join the team, and we very, very quickly got on board with the pre-treatment approach, starting to develop that shared language with people, understanding where people were coming from, starting to help people think a little bit about safety. I suppose where Chris and I came in was that we were faced with two problems. We needed to find a way to translate this absolutely excellent approach into a way that our colleagues on the ground and colleagues around the city could start to assimilate it into their way of working and understand very simply the problems that they were working with. But we also, as John Connolly's pointed out, we needed to find a way to get NHS managers, the National Health Service is very fixed on outcomes and evidence-based approaches and doing things in a very financially viable way. The thing that we struggled with is that if our therapeutic approaches didn't fit with some of the more popular approaches, some of you might be aware that if a treatment approach, a psychological treatment approach, doesn't have an acronym, it's often not recognized. So we had to find a way to adapt this way of working into a way that our colleagues and the managers would get on board with it. As we joined the team, we found that people were trying to work in a very helpful way, but were often using very simple cognitive behavioral approaches that didn't take into account what absolutely terrible histories people had had. They were trying to be supportive and trying to teach people skills, but it was often at the cost of dismissing people's historical trauma and their attachment difficulties. So we had to introduce, from a pre-treatment approach, we had to introduce that common language. Our colleagues were in the inpatient wards, in the addiction services, and the community mental health teams that we worked with. They were trying to force ideas onto people that was hugely re-traumatizing for people. They were telling people that they're addicted. They were telling people that they're psychotic. They're telling people that they're challenging. You need medicating. People were being told there's no place for you. So we had to develop some kind of system that accounted for our colleagues, but also supported these very distressed people living on the street, sofa surfing, in a consistent way, so that we weren't continuing to harm people within a system that had already harmed them. So one of the ways that we did that, similar to what John Connolly has already said, is that we needed to fit the principles of pre-treatment alongside some existing evidence-based treatment. And we needed to do that in the most simple way. And the best way to do that was to present pre-treatment alongside other therapies and say, hey, we're treating personality disorder or complex emotional needs, as we tend to call it now, or we're treating complex trauma, and this is how we're going to do it. So we, likewise, with a lot of the speakers have already said, we were very, very well supported by very kind and very supportive colleagues in the homeless world. John Connolly was our first form of support, reached out to us and shared his story about how he'd integrated pre-treatment into the work in Westminster. Robin Johnson was very kind, but admittedly did tell us that we were going to bumble around and do nothing for the first 2 years. But it was John who helped us understand that if we can take the principles of pre-treatment and hang it onto existing treatments for people who are very traumatized and have very damaged attachment systems, that's going to be a really good way to go. So we brought in MBT, mentalization-based treatment, which is a treatment for people with complex emotional needs. If you're not aware of MBT, it's a really good evidence-based approach for people with histories of trauma and emotion regulation difficulties. And what mentalization does is it helps you slow down and promote safety within the attachment for systems for people who aren't regulating very well, so that they can start thinking about how to have more effective relationships. And what we realized is that pre-treatment and mentalization mapped onto each other absolutely beautifully. And that's where the good stuff happened for us. We added a lot of other theories into our work. As we've talked about in our chapter, we added stages of change approaches. We brought in Judith Herman's seminal work on stages of working with trauma. And what we realized is that all of this works in a very forward-flowing way If we can slow people down, as Chris was talking about earlier on, we can use people's shared language. We don't challenge people. We don't tell them what they're struggling with. We can focus on co-regulating and use the attachment relationship as a vehicle for change. That's where the good stuff happened. So people were saying to us, you're a trauma service. And we were saying, no, we're not. We don't move people until they're safe. We don't do trauma processing. But what we do is we help people think about safety in their relationships, safety in their physical environment, safety in their emotion systems. And once we've done that, then we can help people move on. It'll be other people who carry out that trauma work. So once we started to focus on that, once we brought in other theories, we gave people a very simple way of working, and they understood the task of working with these really heavily traumatized people. What that did is it helped us unite as a team, and we were starting to move in the right direction. And after that, things absolutely took off. And I'll hand back to my colleague, Chris, now to finish our talk off.
Thanks, Dan. Absolutely. I will finish off our wee talk here by talking about how embedded this has become for us as a team. And despite Dan's moving on to pastures new, his legacy is sounding great due to the work that he's put in with us here. Because, of course, the skill is embedding, applying these theories and approaches, but is still maintaining a genuine, authentic, positive relationship, safe relationship with the people who are looking to support. And that takes some going. It certainly does for me. And I forget things most of the time, revert back to my old ways. And when I get a bit lost, I have to come back to what I now class as the fundamental, got a week old, the fundamental aspect of our work here in Hull, which is pre-treatment. Am I going too fast? Am I trying to do too much? Whose agenda is this? Is it mine? Or is it Martin's? Is it Ben's? Is it Gary's? And many of the other people within this city who we look to support and continue to support. And recognizing that the work that we do with the people in this city, it's not a piece of work. It's a commitment to supporting people at various stages of their life. John said to me in the early days, I think I was getting a little bit anxious around how long we work with people, etc. The usual things that you do in a mental health team. And it was around however long it takes for people, because life happens and people will be out of this homelessness arena of the street homelessness within Hull, which can be so damaging. Things can change, things can improve, and unfortunately things may change again for people. And it's about being present and available and being open. And I think for me that's something which, as I say, I hold absolutely true to with whoever I'm working with, which is, without getting too fancy with my words, without trying to probably make a statement for myself. It's actually about that genuine conversation with somebody, caring what their responses are and being genuinely interested in their life. At that point, the rest of the stuff will follow at some stage, but just to recognize that it will take time and it will come and go and ebb and flow as these things do, as relationships do. So thank you very much for your time tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure working on this book with the esteemed people, aforementioned colleagues, and people to follow me. But it's without a shadow of a doubt testament to the people that Dan and I have and continue to work with in Hull that have made everything possible. And that's where I learn so much from on a daily basis. So thank you to those people who remain unnamed within this book. I'm going to pass over now to Ray Middleton. Ray, what can I say that hasn't been said already? But Ray has a PhD in social psychology, is an absolute breath of fresh air in terms of what we want to bring into our team by being an expert by experience, and is a renowned staff trainer too. So Ray, over to you.
Thanks for that very kind introduction. Yeah, I'm Ray Middleton, but I am a doctor, but I'm not the kind of doctor that's any good if you collapse on an aeroplane and people ask if there's one hanging around and the other kind. So yeah, I deliver a trauma-informed program of training. It's kind of workforce development is a better phrase, which combines a number of different approaches, and a significant part of that is pre-treatment. And I'm going to keep my comments, my share here, brief to allow more time for people to ask questions, because that you often get more out of things if people can ask questions and then people can have a go at answering them. You get where people are at. It's more useful. So I'll share a few brief comments about pre-treatment. So first of all, I'd say it's an excellent program and it's very teachable. And not all sets of ideas and skills are teachable, because some of them become overcomplicated because they're maybe trying to please a different kind of audience, an academic audience or other people. And so it's very useful and relevant. So the knowledge and skills is very quickly understood by my experience of teaching pre-treatment in and amongst other approaches, is that it's very comprehensive. It's excellent. It covers all the bases that you need, and it's very useful, but it's not overcomplicated. So it doesn't put people off, because sometimes staff can be keen, their heart can be in the right place, but sometimes it can be difficult to challenge staff. Often when staff are in stressful jobs, like working with people without a home, they can be quite chaotic services, and it makes it difficult for staff to learn. So there's some thought need to be given to helping the workforce to develop and embed these skills, because of the nature of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. Staff are often not in a state to remember and retain knowledge and skills. So it's a skillful thing to think about. A few things I would say, as in addition, would be it links very well, does pre-treatment, with other kind of approaches, knowledge and skills, such as there's something called the power threat meaning framework, which helps staff and people to think about how power operates in people's lives and how they might be responding to power. It's an alternative to the diagnostic approach, the biomedical model of mental health, which, as we've heard already, the medical model tends not to be helpful because for lots of different reasons. And so it links well with narrative approaches, which I teach as well, and trauma-informed care, obviously. So it's quite easy to take pre-treatment and then add in and build on other things, as we heard from Dan there. Another kind of thing, really positive thing about pre-treatment in the practice of training and workforce development, I'd say, is Jay speaks very well about the need to cross a cultural divide. And that's a really big strength of pre-treatment, I would say. There's a bit of a movement in England, I don't know what it's like in America, to try to help staff to become culturally competent, would be the kind of phrase that organizations use. But it's an important topic, and I think Jay has a really nice entry into that world to think about crossing a cultural divide. And you can take that idea and build on it with staff. Obviously, you have to get where people are at and then stretch them a bit into that zone of, where they can develop at the right pace and the right speed. But that's really helpful, the idea about a common language construction, crossing a cultural divide. And I'd say that's really, really a strength. I think the last thing, to keep my comments brief and allow time for questioning, is I'd say it's really worth looking at Jay's section on co-vision or supervision. And helpfully, he's talked about co-vision because it's trying to highlight the power imbalance in supervision often. And there's always power relationships going on between managers and staff and staff and the people we're reaching out to. And power is really important to start to help people to think about that. It's not necessarily a bad thing, power, but it's there and it's often not well thought about or articulated. It's not named. It's a kind of elephant in the room. So I think Jay has an excellent section on co-vision and thinking about how to make the most of group supervision or one-to-one supervision, and thinking about co-vision, try to share the role of supporting each other and reflective practice, obviously. So yeah, that's what I found. The program I do, I've got pre-recorded courses, I should say, that one on pre-treatment, one on the other things I mentioned there. Do get in touch if people want either some of my pre-recorded courses, or I do live training as well. Obviously, do drop me a line if you're interested in any of that stuff. But it's just, it's an excellent approach. And it also, some of the people I trained, it got evaluated by the University of Lincoln, and then it got a really good feedback about how it helped the staff to be more holistic and reflective. And so that's some evidence base around the pre-treatment combined with these other things. It did help staff to kind of move away from this kind of some of the more unhelpful ways of thinking that people can get professionalized into through their training, and think more values-based, holistically narrative, that we're human beings working with human beings. We're not yet at the point of being androids, hopefully, unless you're very advanced in some parts of the world, working with humans. We're humans working with humans. So we want, models that allow us to see ourselves as human beings on a journey, as well as the people that we're attempting to offer help to on a journey. And we don't know everything. What I know is a drop, and what I don't know is an ocean. And I think we need these kind of humble approaches that allow us to be curious and sensitive in the way we work with people when we're trying to offer help. So I think that's hopefully that's a little bit of reflection. But it'd be good to just open it, allow time for questions and answers, because then you can get a bit more out of the other people that are here.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, everyone. I must say I felt a bit emotional listening to everyone transatlantically talking about doing sort of similar work in all these different settings, and facing the same sort of struggles. It made me feel a little bit emotional and very happy. So thank you. Questions. I think we're all used to using Teams, not Zoom, but there is a chat function. If you look at the bottom, it's at the bottom of my screen anyway, the little chat bubble. So you can write questions in the chat, and I have discovered how to raise one's hand. You have to hover over the react button, the little hearts, and then it allows you to raise your hand. So please, people have questions, either write them down or let yourselves be known. But first of all, we've heard from some of the English authors of the book, but if there are any of the American contributors on the call who would like to say anything, please let yourselves be known. I think I saw Jim with us at the start. If you're still there, Jim.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm not sure I contributed much, but except for as you, the honor of being part of the foreword. Yeah, I've followed Jay's work for a long time and been a huge admirer now of both the Levys. The thing that I found is that, and it does give you shivers sometimes, that the things that you've been groping for without language, learning sort of the hard way, trying to follow the deepest humanistic values and instincts that you have to understand where someone's at, not where the system's at. They've captured a great deal of that. There are a number of you over there on the other side of the pond: Nick McGuire, Alistair Story, Nigel Hewitt, Austin O'Carroll, and others that I know have been on the Pathways journey, and we've learned a great deal from you all. So I guess I would just say that for me, the understanding, the deep understanding of the sacredness of the journey we're trying to take, the existential journey to where someone is, it's rather ineffable. I don't think we can ever really fully apprehend where an individual and their trauma history has brought them. My earlier work was in long-term victims of domestic violence, and so the work under bridges is surprisingly similar. The journey that someone's been through to arrive at a place of survival, a place that is uniquely their own, but shares a sense of exclusion from the structurally violent and inflexible systems that we are forced to work within. What I love about your framework is that you capture that, and yet you give us language that we haven't had, and frameworks that I think can be applied across multiple domains. And that, to me, that validates the deeper integrity of what you're all doing. So I'm just really happy to be part of this.
Thank you. And it's very nice to have you in the meeting, Jim. Apologies if you can hear noise in my background. It's my children, who are not as charming a noise as Louise's parakeets. They've been told to be quiet. Please have any questions coming. I have a question. I was really like the idea of being a interpreter and a bridge builder. I think that's a lovely way of putting it. I feel like sometimes I'm building a bridge not just between my team and the people that we work with, but also increasingly struggling to feel any connection with the rest of the trust and the more general service. Who I was struck when you said it was Chris or Dan, I think, said that you worry about how long you're working with people for, and sort of emphasis on letting people take their own time, but that doesn't really fit in with what our higher powers and our trust want us to do. And I wondered if anyone had any practical advice on how to build bridges the other way, and maybe see, or how to help people see the value of what we're doing. I don't know who I'm asking, maybe John or Dan or Chris or Ray.
Sorry, could you repeat that, Jenny?
Just wondering how to, so I think it's so powerful, all the things that everyone talks about, and how it feels like we're doing such a useful thing, but it doesn't feel like it's always in tune with what the trust that employ us want us to do, and how to make them see a different way of doing things and the value of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see someone's put something in the chat, that their organization, a mental health trust, is asking them to do well-being questionnaires and that. I mean, I had a similar issue when I started introducing pre-treatment in my trust. And the case has got to be made, unfortunately. And it can be made. As Dan and Chris was saying, there is a lot of, and Ray, there are a lot of other approaches which are evidence-based, which are very similar to pre-treatment. So like mentalization-based therapy, for example, or attachment theory, all about also trauma and the re-triggering of trauma, so that asking somebody to fill in a questionnaire too early on in the relationship can re-trigger them. So unfortunately, yes, if you're the only one in your organization, you have to make the case. And that's how Dan and Chris and I met, because we all needed to make a case. No easy solutions, I'm afraid.
Thank you, John. I'm sort of reassured that everyone finds it difficult, I guess. Dan, did you want to come in on that, or there's a question in the chat which is, as you allude to, John, about is it possible to complete well-being plans, my well-being plans, with the rough sleepers that we work with? Which I think there's a short answer. It's not easily, and it's not the way you want to start a relationship with somebody. But Dan, do you have any comments?
Yeah, just to follow up what John was saying, really. I think me and Chris in the early days probably recognized that the best way to make some headway was to build allies. And depending on what kind of service that you're working in, I think we didn't have a lot of luck in the early days, but what we were very fortunate with was with leaders that basically got off our back and let us get on with the task. And other people were already supporting pre-treatment. The difficulty that we had is that other services around the city weren't recognising pre-treatment. The best way that we could think of to go about that is to show people results and to basically blind people with science. So as soon as Chris came on board and we were starting to build these relationships, and people were starting to see the effects of people starting to build relationships with us, and starting to talk to us and starting to manage, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour with us. Chris will be able to say a little bit more about this. People started to listen to us then, and we could start to see these little wins. I think the other thing is that, as I'd said a little bit in my talk, was that people had some illusions about what kind of team we were, and people were kind of thinking, oh, you're a personality disorder service, or you're a trauma processing service. We went and did a lot of teaching, and we did a lunchtime slot with the trust where we talked about pre-treatment and how it hung very well with other models, and provided some case studies, and we really got people on board with it, and people were starting to say to us, that sounds like an amazing way, it's so simple. And we were trying to say, yep, it doesn't have to be complicated. The ways that you engage people, you can do it very, very simply, but you have to do a little bit of Yoda work. You have to kind of unlearn what you've learned and just go in with the power of your relationship, and don't challenge people, don't tell people that they're psychotic, don't tell people that they have challenging behaviors, just let the relationship do the work. Do you have anything to add, Chris, on that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Alex. I know you've had your hand up for a while. I'll be brief, which is new for me. I think it's about being pragmatic and realizing that we all have organizational stresses and pressures. We too work for the British NHS, and so paperwork ultimately will have to get done at some point. But I mentioned it very briefly when I spoke earlier around, whose agenda is that? Is that simply because I have to tick a box and get a care plan or a risk assessment or a mental health assessment completed? Or is it actually for the benefit and so on of the person I'm looking to support? And somebody much cleverer than I said, is that paperwork, when complete, going to be a barrier or a passport for somebody? Well, if it's going to be a passport and it will really help people access other services, then absolutely I will crack on with gusto and ensure that that is done as best as possible, as well as possible. If, however, it becomes a tick box exercise, as said before, it becomes, it can become re-traumatized, and it can become an ineffective document. So it's just holding those things in mind when negotiating, I suppose, with the people with the purse strings within your organization.
There was there's a few comments in the chat. One was someone asking if there are. Oh no, hang on. Matt Bennett, would you like to come in on this? Was that I think that was about re-traumatizing people when collecting required information. So filling in paperwork, I guess. Are you there, Matt?
Yes. Hi, everybody. It's
Hello.
great to be here with all these all-stars from the other side of the pond and in the U.S. here. So this has been a huge passion of mine for a long time, of how we ask questions. And in the U.S., we're just terrible at this. Tell me about your psychiatric history. Tell me about your criminal justice history. Revealing a lot of medical issues, that there may be a lot of trauma and shame behind. And we ask these before any relationship is built whatsoever. So I think a lot about in my work, how do we engage people in services around their change? And I was, starting to get into pre-treatment before I met Jay, and I was like, oh, he's done all the work for me already. So it's just been a great, what I found this incredibly useful, and a lot of our presenters have already talked to it. It gives us a model in which to say, okay, just telling somebody they're doing something wrong and potentially harmful, it doesn't lead to change very often. It'll lead to arguments usually. But to offer pre-treatment strategies as an alternative to ways that have traditionally re-traumatized people and led to disengagement is why I have such a passion for the work you all are doing, and an honor to be a small contributor to that work.
Thank you. Where are you, Matt?
I am in Golden, Colorado.
Oh, wow. Okay. We are. It's nice to be so international.
It is.
There is a question about, do we have any feedback from people we support on their experience of pre-treatment model? Anyone have a Jay? Can you comment on that?
We do regular surveys with the people that we serve. And so we, the client consumer survey, they call it. So we're able to get feedback that way on our outreach services. And our outreach services are based on the pre-treatment model. So, we've gotten very positive feedback. And certainly the whole model developed really from the ground up. I think that's important to take notice. So it was really based on what people were telling me and me connecting into their worlds and learning how to do that better and better. So I was really, it's an outreach model. I'm going with the lead of the person that I'm trying to help. That they're really the expert in the beginning. So I think it's been a very effective model. We've had a lot of success, on the relationship end. Of course, pre-treatment doesn't solve the issue of having enough resources. So I just want to put that on the table. That's like super important that, we need more housing. We need more housing with support services. There's an economic engine that disenfranchises people. So pre-treatment really isn't the answer to that. But what it is it's a relationship-based focused. And like people said, I think you can see that the research, on attachment theory, for instance, on getting person-centered in general, Rogerian kind of work that's done is pretty well established and upheld.
Thank you.
I also think that the sort of the proof is in the pudding. I don't have the data and don't know how to collect it, but one of the things that strikes me is that by using, a grounding philosophy that puts that's person-centered and relationship-centered, that as a staff member, it can be just a whole lot easier to see the successes that you're actually achieving with the people that you're working with. You feel like you're making more progress. And from what I've heard over the years also, that for Jay's teams are much more stable, that there is just staff retention and staff satisfaction that really speaks to that idea of how well pre-treatment works as a model, and not to even mention the people who have been most disenfranchised, who multiple workers and multiple services may have reached out to them, but at some point, kind of driven them away with the re-traumatizing. And then someone trained in the pre-treatment model is actually a relationship and a connection with that person and sees success when other workers and other systems have not. So it's that final step of actually drawing back into the community the people who've been most disenfranchised. And again, it's the no one can replace the one, but it's just, I've heard wonderful stories over the years of people who've been pushed to the very edges of our society, and then Jay and his workers have been able to draw them back in. I think it's there. I don't know how you collect the data for that.
Process to the model of pre-treatment. And so you have, for instance, in engagement, there's 3 stages to engagement. So you can kind of measure that on some level, but more importantly, it's actually a guide for staff as where they are in the work, so they're not getting ahead of themselves. The same thing with common language development. There's stages to understanding, utilizing, and bridging language. And that helps people to kind of see where they are in the process. And then change model, you got the stages of change. And so I think the more it gets staff thinking in terms of process, it gives them a guide and it gives them a mode, something that they can utilize in reflective practice by talking about a situation, kind of where things feel stuck. And then if you look at the 5 principles of pre-treatment, where are we with the relationship? Where are we in terms of common language development? Are we supporting any transitions currently? Are we doing more harm reduction right now or more crisis intervention? So those are the kinds of things that I think really give staff, brings to the table basically the kind of thinking and dialogue that they need to be having. And I think staff have felt that it helps them to see that they are making a difference in their work because the stages are micro enough to see the progress that you make. And that I think then connects to what Louise was saying, where people feel less burnt out and they feel more on mission. And it's more about relationships. And isn't that why we really, I think, all went into the work? It's human service, it's relationship based work.
Thank you both. I love what you said earlier instantly, Jay, about embracing the crisis. I think that's a really helpful thing to think about, and I'm sure I will repeat it to my team in the future. And really useful advice about reflecting and thinking about what stage you're at, and that's very helpful. I can see there's a couple of hands up. I just wanted to, there was a lovely question that came up, which perhaps we could think about it whilst other people are speaking, but Rianne saying metaphor comes up often in developing common language. What are your favourite or most poignant metaphors that people have shared about their experiences? So maybe people could just have a think about that and come in later. But Chris, I think your hand went up first to come in on the last question.
Thank you, Jenny. Cheers. Yeah, answering Rian's question there, a wee bit of hope. I'm always brought back to something Dan told me very, very early on in the team around how people will communicate with you in various ways and means. And it's been open and receptive to that from them telling where to go quite creatively, less creatively, or voting with their feet. And I think what pre-treatment is a constant reminder for me is if people aren't going to come down to see me, if they don't turn up for a meeting, well, that's okay. We'll go again. But actually, what are they trying to communicate? What are they trying to say to me at that stage? I wrote in the book about Martin and how he was able to give me some great feedback on the work that we did, which was much in keeping with his way of life and his frames of reference. And after I obviously let him beat me for the 8th time in a game of pool, we were walking back to his flat, and he just said, "It's okay today. I'm all right." And we'd probably been out for an hour and a half together, something like that. And it was really hard for me, I think I mentioned earlier, not to go into sort of mental health practitioner mode and start asking a list of questions. That was enough for then, and that was enough certainly for our relationship to develop from that point too. So yeah, he was able to tolerate me and then tolerate me a little bit more, and that to me was more than enough.
Thank you. Sounds like a powerful moment. So did you let him win at pool, Chris, or John, your hand's also up.
Yeah, sure. I think case exemplars are absolutely fundamental, and they're the first line of defense in the research and evidence arena. And there are very moving cases, and a lot of my ex patients come forward to volunteer, to speak at conferences about their experiences, and commissioners are very receptive to that. And Chris will probably back me up on this. We're members of a working group on a network of psychologists in psychology services for homeless people. And somebody suggested there that we try and set up a national database of case examples of what can be achieved. Now, I'm based in a GP surgery, a medical center. And I know that a lot of the nurses there, a lot of the doctors there are absolutely amazed that some very, very difficult people, and everybody's heart sinks when they come through the door, completely turn their lives around. But it takes several years. It can take 2 to 4 years, which in the NHS is extremely rare to have that time and that latitude to work. But when you think of where people start from, it's absolutely, needed. That time's needed. I'd also just like to say how nice it was to see Matt Bennett, who also contributed a chapter to the book, chapter 2, I believe, and who's written several books on trauma and trauma-informed principles. So good to see you, Matt, and
good to see you too, my friend.
Good to know you're part of the meeting. But yeah, case studies, I'm sure they're the way forward, because they do get people's attention. And commissioners and managers in the field of social exclusion and homelessness, they know how hard it is, and they've already thrown lots of other stuff at the problem. And so they can be quite open to novel approaches like pretreatment. And I think, publishing as much as possible, going to conferences, raising the general profile and re-educating people and questioning some of the basic assumptions. Like the NHS is geared up for a population-wide service, so it's all about quantity. But we know that with us, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. And that means that our numbers are always going to be quite low. But that requires a different perspective. But it's about engaging with some of those hidden assumptions behind questionnaires, behind the evidence base required, and engaging with those hidden assumptions and questioning those and replacing them with more appropriate ones to the people we're dealing with.
Thank you, John. It does strike me that there's a lot of people in this room saying the same sort of things, and that's quite powerful. And maybe we can somehow get, I don't know, the power of the group to convince different commissioners or to put something in place nationally in the UK, like a combined bit of advocacy rather than everyone doing it individually is quite powerful, isn't it? So maybe we can think about that. Jim Withers has put in the chat that there is an international street medicine symposium in Hilo, Hawaii in early September, and we should all consider joining it. So I'm certainly going to consider that, and then think about how big my study budget is, and then maybe not consider it much more, but you never know. Louise has told us that Ginny Bilt, who also contributed to the book, is here. So Ginny, if you are here and would like to say anything, please butt in. Alex, you had your hand up and then it went down, I think.
I did, Jenny, because I had a question which people kind of answered before
Okay.
I'd fully framed it in my mind, but I get there was something actually, John, there's in your chapter you talk at the end about sustainable homemaking, and that reminded me about a presentation you gave a couple of years ago about the kind of fluctuating nature of people's lives and where we're at and how things come and go for people. And I was wondering from the kind of pre-treatment perspective, how it seems to me that it's always relevant. Just because I've been pre-treated once doesn't mean I don't get pre-treated again, but just wondering how that, what the thinking is around that. And I was that made me wary. How far should we be trying to encourage other services to adopt this model into kind of supported housing, mainstream housing, into how far do we spread out some of the insights? I know, John, you developed some training some years ago looking at A&E staff, but we know an emergency department is a quick interaction. They're not really offering relationships. So where are the boundaries? Because the book is called Pretreatment Across Multiple Fields of Practice. in that lobbying sense almost, Jenny, where are the edges of pre-treatment, and where is it kind of, if services are not really able to offer a relationship, should we keep them away from it almost? Is there a risk there? I wonder whether anyone had thoughts about that.
I mean, one thought I have, Alex, is that in a way it has to be opportunistic, and it depends which service we're dealing with or which group of people we're dealing with, and what's possible and what's available. But yes, I'm a great advocate of sustainable recovery and sustainable homemaking, but that's very dependent on an appropriate diagnosis of what underlies the crises. A lot of the people I work with, they've been resettled half a dozen times, but they can't sustain the accommodation because they become very depressed, because they become isolated, they can't reach out, they can't maintain relationships, or they suffer from avoidant personality disorder, whereby relationships are stressful for them. So they avoid, hence avoidant, they avoid relationships, but they become, their life becomes meaningless. So how do you help someone build a meaningful life, meaning? And too much, I find, resettlement services are focused on warehousing people, just getting somebody under a roof and just leaving them to it. Whereas a lot of our people we know have substantial mental health needs, really focused on how to make relationships, how to sustain relationships, and not to find relationships stressful or abusive. There's a lot of self-assertion issues amongst the people we see.
Stad, John, if I could, I think it's really
yeah, of
important
course,
in regard to housing and housing stability,
yeah,
that we have housing plus support services. Really, the key to housing first, being a
yeah,
successful model, is the support service.
yeah,
And the way that's designed in a pre-treatment kind of way, it's respecting the person's choice. It's saying that we're not expecting you to be in treatment. What we're going to do is connect with the person where they're at and work with them based on their needs, their story, their wants, what they find important. But as things come up in the housing, whether it's an issue with paying rent because budgeting is difficult, or it's some other issue, getting along with neighbors, or just being safe, or taking care of the place. All of these become a way, it's kind of a universal thing that everybody's working on to be successful in housing. It's the same for me, it's the same for John and all of us. These are things we have to do, but these are the jump off points for us then to consider also some treatment options when all of a sudden there's a discrepancy between what the person wants, maybe to maintain their housing or to feel safer, and between the behavior that's going on. And we're able, through our common language, to find a way to highlight that discrepancy in a way that it can be heard. And that's really key. So it doesn't turn people off. We already have an established relationship, and we lean on that a lot, speaking to people's values and knowing what they aspire toward, and then looking at what some of the dilemmas are, what some of the barriers are to maintaining housing. So you could do that virtually in any service, but I will say that pre-treatment is particularly designed to reach vulnerable populations, people that are disenfranchised, to be more inclusive, and to work across cultural divides in terms of the dialogue that we do. So it's really a judgment. I mean, you could do that in one session on some level with some people, and it's still helpful to have that pre-treatment background, but it's really designed for the more vulnerable, disenfranchised person. And I know we're coming to an end, but I just want to say there's so many examples with bridging language and how we go about doing that. Someone brought up common language in a question. I know I worked with one gentleman He talked about being mentally murdered, wanted nothing to do with any kind of mental health service or any of that. But he really felt he was an African American male, black male who felt very oppressed and mistreated and victimized. And my goal was to connect with him on that. And then we sort of bridged the language over to trauma. And then for trauma, we were able to bridge it over to whether he would qualify for a benefit because he was doing his research, which he found to be very important. That was the meaning in his world. And a benefit could help him have a place to do his research. So it was all based on his goals, his motivation, and that's how we bridge the language.
Thank you, Jay. That's a nice thing to end on, actually, thinking about bridging gaps and common language, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? Everyone, it has been wonderful. I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We do need to end it because I guess everyone has their evenings to get on with, and our American colleagues have their afternoon clinics and things to do, and going to do some pre-treatment in action. Alex has reminded us, as I was going to, that we've got, before Hawaii, there is the Pathway Conference in March, which Alex has put a link in the chat. Please do come. We're going to have a meeting of the Mental Health Network on the second day, which I will be chairing, and I was hoping that we could use it to think about what we were saying earlier about how to use the power of us all in the network. There's a lot of us, we should make ourselves be heard. So thinking about how we can do that and what we want to be heard saying. So please do come if you can. Jay, I think the only final thing from you, can you tell us how to buy your book?
Well, it's in the UK, probably the best place is on Amazon to get the book. But you can find it. I mean, it's a main distributor, so you could have any bookshop order it in.
Okay.
Foils, any of the bookshops
any of our
that are
major
local.
bookshops. That's good to know.
Waterstones, I know has it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, in that case, I will thank everybody again for coming, especially those who've visited from America. It's really felt a privilege to have you, as I say. And I hope to see lots and lots of you at the conference in 2 months' time. Thank you.
Thank you.